When everything seems lost, when the ground disappears beneath our feet, when our mind screams and our heart no longer knows what to feel, it is in that moment that the truest prayer is born. Not the one full of beautiful words, but the one that comes out with tears, with a choked voice, with a tight chest, with our gaze fixed on the sky, as if to say, "Lord, if you don't act now, I don't know what will become of us." How many times have you felt like this? Walking in the dark, trying to be strong, but inside, completely broken. Today, in this video, you will learn about the psalm that was used by people who were exactly at this limit and who, when they cried out, saw God respond immediately. Stay with me until the end, because I believe the same God who intervened in that story can do the same in yours today. They were lost and felt the invisible weight of a profound loneliness. Some had been abandoned in the emptiness of directionless paths. Others found themselves trapped in nameless anguish. There are those who know the feeling of walking through internal deserts, where each step seems to lead nowhere, and the thirst is not only for water, but for answers, for a look that tells them there is still a reason to exist. It is in this geography of the heart that the story begins, and where the first psalm gains a voice of hope. The narrative is intertwined with the real lives of people who are enduring days of uncertainty. A man who has lost his job and does not know how to support his family. A woman whose friendships have suddenly been severed, leaving only echoes of empty memories. Someone who has discovered, from personal experience, that being ignored by society is one of the most acute forms of emotional abandonment. All of this makes up a fragmented scenario, where darkness seems to have taken over every corner. But it is not just about disorientation. It is also the fear that spreads when tomorrow promises no horizon. And there is a common element that unites these experiences, the cry for relief that goes beyond human vision. And when prayer is used, many realize that it is not just about words, it is about an encounter, the intensity of pouring oneself out before God, without artifice, without staged phrases, a cry coming from the essence, articulated by an ancient psalm that, even though it was written more than 1,000 years ago, seems to echo within the dry heart of those who seek the divine to find their way again. The idea is not just to tell stories of despair, it is to provoke a natural identification. The parents who were looking for comfort, who just wanted a light at the end of the road, are seen as witnesses. The reader-viewer is invited to remember their own sleepless nights, the moments when everything seemed to be falling apart, and when, even when they were so young, they dared to raise their gaze and voice to God. In silence, in their anguished chest, with the almost painful conviction that this was a very urgent request. At the heart of this pain lies a text that needs to be listened to carefully. Psalm 107, verses 4 to 9. A passage that is not popular in routine preaching, but whose strength lies precisely in the experience reported, souls that wandered aimlessly without finding direction or shelter, people who were hungry, thirsty, and had the courage to cry out. The text presents almost cinematic scenes, total disorientation followed by a cry for help, and the divine response, without delay, deliverance. Each word resonates with the experience of those who felt the miracle happen. At this point, the script moves on to the sensorial description of the text. It is not a cold study. The reader feels the scorching sun, the tiredness in the muscles, the dust covering the skin, the throat scratching for water. And finally, the cry that breaks through the silence. They cried out to the Lord in their anguish. At that moment, everything is focused on the act of exposing the soul in an urgent request. And God's gaze turns to that cry. The immediate miracle happens. It is the promise fulfilled. Water appears, shelter appears, strength returns. Helplessness turns into help. That is why this passage of the psalm is so striking. It does not speak of manners, rituals, or external postures. It speaks of the exposed heart, of people who allow themselves to be vulnerable before the source that can restore. The result? A complete transformation. The night that seemed eternal gives way to dawn, and the cry of despair gives way to songs of gratitude, which rise not only because they have been taken out of anguish, but also because they feel seen. This is the first step. It already conveys the essence of what it means to pray with a psalm like this. Lost people, crying out firmly, receiving the answer. The human scene is established. Emotion connects with the divine. And at the same time, it creates a natural space to move forward, without signaling that there is a next block, but maintaining the growing involvement of the audience. The previous story made it clear that there are times when divine help arrives like an oasis in the middle of the desert. But there are situations in which the danger is not visible to the eyes. It is not just about hunger, thirst, or lack of shelter. There are invisible prisons made of fear, anxiety, and a feeling of suffocation that seems to tighten the chest with each breath. This is when the danger becomes internal, emotional, and often spiritual. The soul finds itself surrounded by an inexplicable fear, as if at any moment everything would collapse. And it is at this point that the narrative takes on new colors, new textures, and new depth. The scene now changes. It is no longer a physical desert, but a mental and emotional environment where the person feels as if he or she is about to be swallowed up by circumstances. The mind becomes a battlefield. The heart races, hands tremble, thoughts become jumbled. There is an internal struggle going on without others noticing. And the psalm chosen for this moment describes this reality with unique intensity. Psalm 18, especially verses 4 to 19, is a true portrait of someone who finds himself surrounded, oppressed, cornered by the forces of fear and hopelessness. The words used by the psalmist are almost visceral. He speaks of cords of death, of torrents of destruction, of snares of Sheol, and of nets of death that stretched out before him. These are not just poetic metaphors. They are images of someone who has felt the weight of a real and imminent threat on his own skin. It is as if each sentence of this psalm was written with tears and sweat, with a ragged breath and a scream caught in the throat. As the verses come to life, the script explores the nuances of this internal battle. It shows the character facing his fears, perhaps in a dark room, alone, feeling the weight of anxiety on his chest. Every minute seems like an eternity. Every thought is a trap. There is a feeling that the end is near, even without a concrete reason for such despair. But it is precisely at this moment that the deepest cry arises. The cry that was previously held back finally breaks through the internal barriers and transforms into a prayer full of truth. The psalmist describes exactly this. In his distress, he cried out to the Lord. And what happens next is one of the most powerful accounts of divine intervention found in Scripture. God not only heard the voice of the one who cried out, he responded with a force that breaks the limits of nature. The biblical narrative describes tremors in the earth, smoke rising from God's nostrils, fire coming out of his mouth, the heavens opening, lightning flashing across the sky, thunder echoing in all directions. It is a description that conjures up a God who not only hears, but who rises up in holy fury to help those who suffer. The biblical text is clear in saying that God bent down to hear the cry. It was not a distant, formal, or indifferent response. It was a personal, intense, and direct involvement. God came down, moved the heavens, shook the foundations of the earth, and came to meet the one who prayed. The power of this passage is so great that the words resound like thunder in the soul of the reader. And the help was not just symbolic. God reached out, grabbed hold, pulled him out of the many waters, and placed the one who cried out in a safe place. It is impossible not to feel the vibration of this intervention when reading the psalm. And the script follows this rhythm, leading the viewer through this almost cinematic moment of liberation. This divine response does not happen silently. The text details the arrival of help with images of power and majesty. The sky darkens, thunder echoes, lightning flashes across the horizon. It is as if all of nature responds to the cry of a distressed heart. And this brings about an inevitable reflection. How many times are our greatest battles invisible to the world, but completely visible to the eyes of God. The biblical account does not speak of a long wait, of a drawn-out process. The help is immediate, direct, and transformative. There is an urgency in God's response that comforts and encourages. The one who felt like he was about to sink into the waters of anguish now finds himself standing on solid ground, breathing deeply, feeling life return to his body. The narrative continues to explore the emotions of relief, gratitude, and even disbelief at the miracle recently experienced. It is not uncommon that, after moments like this, the person looks back and can hardly believe that they were truly freed from such an oppressive situation. This passage from Psalm 18 reveals that God is not indifferent to human suffering, especially when the cry is genuine and comes from the depths of the soul. There is no distance, no obstacle, no opposing force that can impede God's action when he decides to intervene. The story progresses with the emotional intensity still high. There are no pauses to start over, just a natural progression of the narrative, which continues to touch the soul of those who follow each detail, word by word. After describing the divine help that broke the silence and brought relief to those who felt themselves sinking, the narrative moves on to another dimension of the human experience. There are many who, even after physical or emotional deliverance, continue to fight invisible battles. Fear sometimes remains like a persistent shadow. Not a specific fear, but a constant restlessness, a state of alert that never seems to cease. It is as if the heart has become accustomed to waiting for the next blow, the next bad news, the next unexpected loss. Life goes on, but the mind remains trapped in a cycle of worries, anticipating dangers that often never happen. This is the emotional scenario that precedes Psalm 34, verses 4 through 7. A prayer born of deep fear, made by someone who carried within himself a collection of anxieties. The psalmist begins by describing the search. "I sought the Lord, and he answered me." This is no ordinary phrase. It carries the weight of sleepless nights, of tears shed without witnesses, of racing thoughts that gave no respite. The search was intense, sincere, desperate. A search for relief, for peace, for an answer that would be able to silence the whirlwind of feelings that dominated him. The narrative goes on to show how fear, when not faced, can paralyze life. How many decisions are not made because of anxiety? How many projects are abandoned? How many relationships are damaged by the distrust generated by constant fear? The text of the psalm reflects this reality. Fear became an invisible but powerful enemy, which needed to be faced with an equally strong weapon: sincere prayer. The psalmist's cry received a clear and direct answer. God delivered him from all his fears. Not just some, not just the most urgent or obvious, but all of them. This all-encompassing promise is a relief for those who live with different types of fear. The fear of loss, the fear of not being enough, the fear of suffering again, the fear of being alone, the fear of the future. The continuation of the narrative leads the viewer to reflect on their own fears, not as an exposition of weaknesses, but as an exercise in sincerity with oneself. Recognizing fear is the first step to being freed from it. The prayer that begins with this recognition is genuine, full of truth, and has a powerful effect in the eyes of God. The psalm also offers a heartwarming image. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. This expression is not just symbolic. It reveals God's constant care, a protective enclosure, a presence that surrounds and guards, even when dangers seem invisible to human eyes. There is an invisible army working on behalf of those who, in the midst of fear, choose to trust. The narrative gains depth by exploring the contrast between the previous emotional state and the reality after divine intervention. Where there was restlessness, there is now peace. Where there was previously insecurity, there is now confidence. This transformation does not happen automatically, but as the fruit of an intimate experience with God, lived through prayer. Throughout this section, the script explores everyday situations that fit perfectly into this spiritual reality. People who face anxiety attacks, who carry traumas from the past, who live in fear of the future. Each example is treated with respect, showing that the psalmist's experience is not something distant or inaccessible. On the contrary, it is a faithful representation of the emotional struggles that so many people face today. The cry for freedom from fear is one of the purest forms of prayer. There are no masks, no prepared speeches, only the vulnerability of those who recognize their own limitations and ask for help. God responds not only with momentary relief, but with a profound transformation that reaches thoughts, emotions, and the way we see life. This liberation has a direct impact on daily attitudes. What once seemed impossible now becomes feasible. Decisions begin to be made with greater confidence. The mind, previously occupied with negative predictions, begins to harbor thoughts of hope. Fear loses its strength, not because circumstances have magically changed, but because God's presence brings a type of security that the world cannot offer. The script continues to move forward without artificial interruptions, keeping the viewer immersed in this journey of overcoming, healing, and emotional transformation. The narrative continues to explore in depth the relationship between human outcry and divine response, always respecting the biblical text, the emotional experience of the characters, and the reality of those who follow each detail of this story of faith. After following the internal struggle against fears and the emotional liberation provided by the divine response, the narrative continues to delve deeper into the process of soul restoration. There are situations in which the problem is not just fear of the future or anguish in the present, but the feeling that the past has left irreversible marks. These are memories that insist on remaining alive, thoughts that return with force in moments of silence, and a constant feeling that life has stagnated in a cycle of sadness and guilt. It is in this context that Psalm 40, especially verses 1 through 3, takes on an even more intense meaning. The psalmist describes the period of waiting with honesty. It was not a brief or superficial experience. There was patience, perseverance, and an emotional resilience that only those who have faced long periods of silence know how difficult it is to maintain. The phrase, "I waited patiently for the Lord," sums up days, weeks, or perhaps months of expectation, of repeated prayers, and of moments when hope seemed to disappear. The experience described is rich in emotional detail. The psalmist uses strong images to describe the state he found himself in. A pit of perdition, a mire of mud. Anyone who has ever faced depression, a feeling of abandonment, or any form of deep hopelessness understands perfectly what these metaphors mean. The pit represents a place of isolation, where the light does not reach, where there seems to be no air, and where every attempt to escape only results in sinking even deeper. The mire of mud represents a lack of stability, a feeling of emotional instability, the fear that any movement could make the situation worse. However, the story does not end with suffering. The text highlights the decisive moment of divine intervention. God did not remain indifferent to the psalmist's cry. He bent down. This expression reveals closeness, attention, and care. It was not an automatic or cold response. God demonstrated personal involvement with the pain of the one who was waiting. The gesture of bending down indicates a movement of dissent, of approach, of deep consideration for the tears and silent groans. The description of deliverance is as vivid as the description of suffering. God took the psalmist from that place of destruction and set him on a rock, a stark contrast, from an unstable and stifling environment to a place of safety, firm and solid. This transition represents much more than a physical change. It is an inner transformation. The heart that was once broken now experiences security. The mind that was once filled with thoughts of defeat is now filled with hope. The text goes on to detail the process of restoration. God has established the psalmist's steps. He has not only lifted him out of the mire, but has also ensured stability for the future. This is a powerful image. This is not just a momentary relief, but a complete rebuilding of the ability to walk confidently. Previous falls would no longer be a cause for fear. The new ground provided by God is secure enough to allow for firm and decisive steps. As if that were not enough, God placed a new song in the mouth of the one who had previously only known the groan of pain. Praise became the new language, not just a song of gratitude, but a public declaration of faith. The psalmist began to sing about God's faithfulness, about the power of transformation, about the grace that reaches even the darkest places of the human soul. The narrative continues to connect these images with the reality of so many people who, today, face similar situations. There are those who, upon hearing this story, will remember their own experiences of waiting, silence, and restoration. Others may still be in the pit, waiting for the answer that seems not to come. The text then becomes an invitation to perseverance, a reminder that, even in the darkest times, God is still attentive. He is still listening. He is still preparing the exact moment to intervene. It is important to emphasize that the process described by the psalmist was not just an emotional experience. It was a complete change in perspective on life. The new song represents a new vision of the world, a new way of facing difficulties, a renewal of faith that had previously been fragile. As the story progresses, the script maintains the same level of emotion and depth. There are no sudden interruptions or artificial transitions. The viewer remains involved in the natural sequence of the narrative, following step by step the journey of someone who has gone from despair to a place of safety and praise. Practical application is inevitable. Each person, in their own context, can recognize the pits they face, the mud that tries to trap them, the silent nights that insist on prolonging the pain. But the promise contained in this psalm remains alive. God listens. God bends down. God acts. And when he decides to intervene, the result is a complete transformation, capable of restoring not only the external condition, but also the internal structure of faith, hope, and the ability to sing again. The emotional and spiritual journey we have followed so far has revealed a God who listens, responds, and transforms situations of fear, despair, and abandonment into living testimonies of hope and restoration. But there is one aspect of this journey that needs to be explored in even greater depth: the way in which each experience of pain can generate a new understanding of God's character and the identity of those who cry out for help. Overcoming fear is a big step. Being pulled out of a pit of despair is a memorable victory. However, there is an even deeper dimension: the spiritual maturity that comes after deliverance. The psalmist, when recounting his experience in Psalm 40, not only describes physical and emotional deliverance, but also shows a process of inner transformation that goes beyond momentary circumstances. The new song that emerged from his mouth is not just a song of thanksgiving. It is a new way of seeing life, of interpreting events, and of reacting to the challenges that would still come. There is no promise that the struggles would cease forever, but there is the certainty that, from then on, each new problem would be faced with a more solid faith, rooted in the living memory of God's intervention. This phase of the spiritual journey is marked by a sense of responsibility. Those who experience a miracle begin to feel, in a certain way, the duty to share what they experienced. Not out of religious obligation, but because true gratitude overflows. The psalmist makes a point of stating that many will see the deliverance he received and will trust in the Lord because of it. This is one of the most beautiful consequences of a well-lived testimony. Personal experiences of faith become sources of hope for others who are still in the midst of the storm. The narrative continues to delve deeper into this aspect, showing that suffering is never in vain. Every tear, every night of affliction, every seemingly unanswered cry, all of this takes on new meaning when divine intervention occurs. Suffering becomes a story of overcoming, a tale of faith, an inspiration for those who observe from the outside. God does not waste pain. He transforms it into testimony. The script makes a point of illustrating this truth with real-life examples. A mother who spent years praying for her son's recovery. A young man who faced deep depression and now helps others who are in a similar situation. A couple who, after nearly losing everything, now counsels others on how to restore relationships. These stories are not just emotional illustrations. They reflect the constant movement of God in the lives of ordinary people who chose to transform their pain into an instrument of faith and service. This dimension of spiritual responsibility is a milestone in the journey of those who cry out sincerely. The psalmist, after experiencing his deliverance, did not keep his testimony to himself. He sang, he declared. He made his experience a source of encouragement for others. The script explores this dynamic in depth, highlighting that the cycle of faith does not end when the answer arrives. On the contrary, it is there that a new mission begins. Another important aspect of this process is the growth of trust in God. Those who experience deliverance learn to recognize the signs of divine presence even in the most subtle situations. Small details of everyday life begin to be seen as special care from God. The eye becomes more sensitive, spiritual perception sharper. Faith ceases to be just theory and becomes an unshakable conviction. The text goes on to show how this new perception of faith affects all areas of life. The way we deal with problems changes. Daily conversations begin to reflect more hope. Decisions are made with more confidence, based on the certainty that God is still present and attentive. The person who once cried out in despair now intercedes for others with spiritual authority. The one who once cried alone now comforts those who are on the brink of despair. The narrative delves even deeper when it reflects on the social impact of this type of transformation. Faith lived authentically begins to influence friends, family, co-workers, and even strangers. Attitudes change, behavior becomes more compassionate, and love for others grows stronger as a natural consequence of a grateful heart. The psalmist describes how many will see and fear, putting their trust in the Lord. This reveals a continuous cycle of faith and transformation. One person's experience becomes the impetus for another's faith. Individual testimony sets off a chain reaction of hope. Each person reached by the story of deliverance begins to have their own experience with God. And so faith multiplies, grows stronger, and reaches places that previously seemed unreachable. The script continues to explore how this new phase of spiritual life is not without its challenges. On the contrary, it brings with it new responsibilities and often new battles. But now, with a solid foundation of faith, the way to face adversity is completely different. The heart that has already seen the hand of God acting once begins to trust that He will act again, always at the right time and in the perfect way. The psalmist makes it clear that the cycle of crying out, responding, and transforming is part of an ongoing journey with God. Each phase of life brings new opportunities to trust, cry out, and experience God's faithfulness in even more surprising ways. It is not a straight line, but a path full of ups and downs, where each step is sustained by the certainty that God is a present help in every situation. As the viewer follows this reflection, the emotional and spiritual connection deepens. There is no sense of conclusion or closure, just the natural continuation of a story of faith that still has much to be lived and shared. The audience's heart is led to understand that, regardless of where they are on this journey, God remains attentive, present, and ready to act again. The dust still seemed to hang in the air as the echoes of God's final answers began to settle in the heart of the one who had cried out. The feeling of relief was real, but along with it came a strange mixture of tiredness and expectation. His body was exhausted, like someone who had gone through a storm, but his spirit brought a new strength that, although discreet, was noticeable. Something inside him knew that this moment of divine intervention was not the end of everything, but the beginning of a new reality. The next steps were taken with a different caution. There was a fear that despair would return, but at the same time there was a new conviction, as if the ground had become firmer underfoot. The voice that I had previously barely been able to whisper now began to rehearse words of praise. Not a festive praise, but a kind of gratitude that emerges slowly, with the timidity of someone who still remembers the pain, but who recognizes that God's presence made a difference. As he walked, The rescued man began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. The sound of leaves rustling, the warmth of the sun on his skin, even the distant murmur of a spring. Every small sign of creation now seemed like a silent message that life had been restored. It was not a new beginning with blank pages, but a continuation of history with deep marks of learning. As the days passed, his thoughts involuntarily returned to the moment of the cry. It was impossible to forget the sound of his own voice, broken by despair, calling for help. And as unforgettable as the cry for help was the memory of the response. There was no denying that help had come. Now, the man who had previously cried alone felt the responsibility of telling this story. Not to show off, but so that others would know that God continues to listen. The words of Psalm 40 came back to me with surprising clarity. It was as if each verse took on a life of its own, echoing within my mind and reinforcing the idea that there was a greater purpose behind that experience. The new song that emerged from my lips was a direct consequence of my deliverance. There was no rehearsal, no prepared script, just a sequence of words of gratitude that escaped naturally at random moments throughout the day. The transformation was also visible in their eyes. Where before there had been weariness and a certain emptiness, there was now brightness, determination, and a kind of peace that did not depend on circumstances. Every time they met other people, they had the opportunity to talk about what had happened. It was not a dramatic account to impress, but a sincere confession that God's help had arrived at the most critical moment. In some conversations, the response was one of surprise. In others, of skepticism. There were those who listened attentively and, in silence, reflected on their own internal struggles. And so it was that, without realizing it, the one who had once been on the verge of collapse began to become a point of reference for those who were still trapped in their own emotional deserts. With each story told, faith grew stronger. There was no room for doubt. What had been experienced was real. The fear that had previously paralyzed people now gave way to a discreet but solid courage. The following days were not free of difficulties. Problems continued to arise. Some situations still brought up concerns, but there was one essential difference. The heart now knew where to seek help. On the quietest nights, when thoughts tried to create labyrinths of worry, the echo of the Psalms returned like a balm. The words read earlier now had a new weight, a meaning that went beyond theory. Each verse seemed tailor-made for that specific moment in life. The desire to seek God's presence became more intense. Prayers, which had previously been rushed and formal, were now sincere dialogues, often interrupted by tears, but always filled with truth. There was no rush to finish, no concern for the right words, just complete surrender, like someone who finally understands that God cares about every detail of their existence. The perception of divine action also began to manifest itself in small things. An unexpected connection from a friend, an encouraging message received at just the right moment, a passage of scripture that seemed to have been written precisely for that situation. Every detail reinforced the idea that God was attentive, watching over and guiding our steps in a subtle but effective way. There was also a new way of looking at the suffering of others. The heart that had previously been focused only on one's own pain now became more sensitive to the suffering of others. A discouraged co-worker, a neighbor facing family problems, a friend struggling with anxiety. In each of these faces, one could see traces of a pain that had once been familiar. The desire to help grew every day, not as an obligation, but as a natural consequence of those who know what it is to be reached by divine mercy. The help received now became help offered. A hug, a word of encouragement, sincere advice, a prayer said silently in the midst of the rush of the day. And even in those moments when doubt tried to resurface, all one had to do was close one's eyes and remember what had already been experienced. The memory of deliverance was enough to silence the inner voices of fear and insecurity. There was no longer any room for hopelessness. The certainty that God is a safe refuge remained like a firm anchor, sustaining faith even in the face of new challenges. Each morning was greeted with a renewed sense of gratitude. Simply opening my eyes, taking a deep breath, and feeling the warmth of the sun was reason enough to be thankful. Life was not perfect, but it was full of meaning. The journey continued, with its unexpected twists and turns, but now there was a solid confidence that no matter what happened, God would continue to be present, listening, responding, and sustaining each new step. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.